where you can, a few different places where the attacks can happen. When a user first connects to a service, the first time you log into an app, either in a web browser or if you're authenticating an app on your phone to the service, somehow or other there's an exchange of credentials there. And then as you use the app, as you're sitting there in the browser clicking on different things or in your app flipping through different screens, packets go back and forth. Every one of those packets has to be somehow authenticated so the server knows it's you because it's a stateless protocol. And then there's sort of a restart functionality, like when you log in again. So if you haven't touched the app in a month or 2 months and you fire it up on your phone and it still knows you're there, chances are pretty good any kind of session tokens will have expired. So there's something on the device that is still able to prove to the server that you're still you without you having to enter your password again. So in all these cases, attackers trying to steal credentials. If all they've got access to is the network, they'll disable TLS and try and read stuff. If they have access to the server or the server network, perhaps they can catch the credentials as they slide by on the way to the application. I've certainly seen some applications where the encryption doesn't make it all the way down to the end server. It stops at a load balancer, SSL is stripped off, SSL added and removed here. It's stripped off and then it goes down to the servers over HTTP. It's all internal network, so it's theoretically secure. But if an attacker hacks one of those things and runs TCP dump, now they see all the passwords flying by. I'm not sure how prevalent that design is, but it's certainly something that does happen. They could also attack it as it's being used. If you're actually able to break into the server and modify the software on the server or on the client, like on a desktop, you could install a keylogger and just grab it as they're typing the keys. And then obviously storage, stealing a password database from a server, or if you've got a client, you've got tokens and other credentials stored on the iPhone, try and extract that. So I mentioned sessions, and certainly whenever you're using the app and sending requests to the server, you could send your password every single time if you wanted to, but that's kind of silly because it puts your password at greater risk. So maybe you use a token, a special code that only lasts for an hour, a day, a couple days, something like that. Everybody has slightly different perspectives on what the right expiration time is. So you send a token up saying, here's my token, here's my request. I'm going to get a cat GIF. Well, if an attacker can steal that token, they can just send their own packet up to the server that says, give me all your money. Why a service can give you cat GIFs and money at the same time, I don't know. It's a full-featured web app. So one thing that people can do is they can add something called a nonce to the token. It's something that's associated with the token that can only be used once. So the server sees a request come through for cat GIF, it's got a token's valid, it's got a nonce, I've never seen this nonce, says, okay, I'll process this. And then it writes that nonce in a little list and says, I've used this before. If an attacker replays that exact same authentication with a different payload, the server is going to say, I've seen this nonce before. Everything looks good, but you've used this before, I'm going to deny the request. And that helps to prevent a replay attack where somebody can sniff the connection, get your credentials, and just make requests as you. They have to be able to recreate that nonce. Well, if a nonce is just a random number and the server tracks them, obviously you can just make up your own nonce. So what you have to do is somehow or other tie that cryptographically to the rest of the credentials in the packet. It's also helpful to include a timestamp alongside the nonce or as part of the string, because that way the server doesn't have to track every single thing you've ever said. It can just say, track the last 5 minutes worth of stuff, and if one comes in with an old timestamp, it just throws it away. And again, then the timestamp would also have to be cryptographically tied to everything, otherwise you can just change that. So now we can talk about some actual systems. There are dozens of systems available out there today that people can use for authenticating these applications. In practice, only a few are really in common use. I'll describe 5 of them here, and I've seen maybe 2 or 3 or as many as 4 other systems beyond that. They're very rare, maybe 1 or 2 customers. Like Oasis SAML is a really powerful spec. It's massive, it's huge, it's crazy. I've seen it once, and I can't even remember where the hell I saw it, because I was going to put that in this talk, and I can't remember it, and there's so many different things that you can do with it. Most of the time, it's going to be one of these 5 systems. And of these 5, 3 of them are generally built into the browser, so it's a system that's available directly to a web app. The other ones, OAuth 1 and 2, aren't really built into browsers, so they're really only available for dedicated applications. So authorization basic. Set your user ID and the password to the server. Send it on the URL line, which is really dumb. Send it as individual HTTP headers. Send it as a base64 encoded string in an authorization header. Send it in the URL as MD5 pass equals and then the MD5 pass. I've seen all of these methods, including the MD5 pass called out as MD5 pass, which is very convenient. So it works. It's very simple. It's very easy. You can just build a form in your web page and submit it, and the server processes it. It's simple. You can have the server send back a www.authenticate header, which causes the browser to pop up its own password form. Great. It's perfectly fine as long as you trust TLS. As soon as TLS breaks, you're screwed and the password gets divulged. And again, using this as a session authenticator, where it's passed every single time, increases the risk of that disclosure. And again, never put in the URL. So that was the first of 5. That was easy. Authorization digest is somewhat more complicated. What happens with this is you connect to the server says, okay, give me some stuff, here's some parameters. The client combines those parameters along with your password and sends up a token that's all of those are cryptographically tied. The password itself is never actually sent over the network, which is fantastic. A hacker can see this whole transaction, they can't do anything at all, they can't get your password out of it. So here's a more detailed description. Client asks for a web page, a GIF or something. Server says, okay, authenticate to me and use the digest mode. And here's a realm, which is kind of a server namespace. It might be an application name, it might be a DNS name of the server, something like that. Here's a random nonce. Here's the algorithm we're going to use, which there's not really many algorithms, unfortunately. And a QOP, quality of protection. The client takes those things, takes some other data, sometimes a client nonce and a nonce counter, combines all those things with your password, sends it back up. So here's what it's actually doing. It takes your user ID, the realm the server gave you, and your password in plain text, separates them with colons, takes the MD5 hash of that string. Then it takes the nonce the server gave you, a client counter, the nonce the client creates, and the quality protection, stores those as a string, and then it takes the method and pass, so like get in uppercase and then /login, joins all those things together, and it takes the method and path are MD5 hashed as well. Then it takes all those, throws them together, so the hash, those other 4 things, and another hash, one great big string, takes the MD5 hash of that and sends it back. So this is what you end up looking like. The client sends back an HTTP header, says www authenticate digest, and then all this stuff. It's all one great big line with no returns. It just keeps going on and on. And you've got the nonce that the server gave you, you've got the realm, you've got the algorithm, opaque, which is kind of just a number the server gives you and the client gives back, quality protection, some other things like that. I'm sorry, this is what the server says to the client. So then here's an example of the actual hashing. So you've got the password, or the user ID, you've got the realm, I'm not going to pronounce that, and you've got his password, which is of course enchanter, because this is Tim the Enchanter. Take the hash of all that, you get a hex string. You've got the get and slash as the method and the path. Take the hash of that, you get another hex string. And then you take the MD5 of the first string, all the other stuff in the last string, and you get your response. And then you send it back as a new header with all the information there. So now with this response, the server has everything it needs to do to recreate the response on the server side. And if the response the server creates itself matches the response you've given, then you've proven that you have access to that password. It's a pretty good system. You don't usually see this for session credential use. But because it's got these nonces, it helps to prevent the replay attack. The nonce example that I showed here, you see that 14508 whatever, that's a Unix timestamp. So the nonce actually has a timestamp kind of embedded inside the string. So that helps as well. Password is not sent over the network. The quality of protection, I mentioned that before. Usually it's just auth, and that just simply does authentication. If it's auth int, that provides some additional integrity protections. And there's another hash that gets involved in that whole signature. There's a hash of the message body. So now you've got some protection against somebody intercepting a packet and modifying the request and still using the original request. Problems are that this relies on an MD5 hash of the username, realm, and password. If the server wants to rebuild this on the fly, it's got to have your plain text password in a database, and that's obviously a bad thing. So what a lot of them will do is they'll just have a username realm password, and now you got an MD5 of that triplet, and that's what's stored on the server. Still something that might be brute forced. Some of this could be brute forced in transit even. But also, because that hash of username realm password is the only thing that's really secret, if we go back here, somebody attacks the server, they get that hash out of the server, they just drop it right into this whole thing, and they never need to know your password, and then just authenticate it yourself. So having the hash compromises the account. You don't even have to crack the password. So really good that it's not sending the password across, really bad in that if the database is compromised, the user is compromised. So NTLM. It's kind of similar to Digest in a lot of ways, but it's a proprietary, not very well publicly documented protocol. It's binary, it's ugly, it uses UTF-16, which if anybody's ever done strings on Windows data, you got all these spaces in the words and it's impossible to grep, and we hate it. We hate it forever. The way that this works, somebody connects to a web page, it says unauthorized, use NTLM. So the next line in that block is the client speaking back to the server saying, okay, authorization, NTLM, and a string of base 64 digits. I got a hex dump of that below. It's, like I said, it's all binary, so it starts off with a little header of NTLM, SSP, and there's some flags in there that really don't pertain right now. But there's again, it's all binary protocol, lots of little bells and whistles. And I'm just scratching the surface on NTLM. There's lots of data, lots of details, lots of little tricks that I'm not even going to go into. So the client says, okay, let's do this. The server sends back a message. It's got a big block of data in there. There's a challenge in there, and there's a target block. And both of those will be described in a moment. The user's browser in the first version of NTLM takes a user's password, calculating a hash on it. And what it does with that is it turns it UTF-16, does an MD4 hash on it. That's the NTLM v1 hash standard. Adds 5 bytes of zeros, so now you've got 21 bytes. Splits that into 3 chunks of 7 bytes each. Turns those into DES keys. Encrypts the challenge with each key, one at a time. Gloms them all together to make one response. And then it does the same thing with the old landman hash if you have that enabled. So creating the DES key is kind of strange. You've got 7 bytes. What it does is it takes the 7 bits out of each byte and kind of spreads them out across 8 bytes, and then the missing low order bit of every byte becomes a parity bit. So it's kind of strange. It's hard to follow. When you look at the slides in person, you can kind of draw little lines and it makes more sense. So anyway, here's an example where you take the password, turn it to UTF-16, take an MD4 hash of it, do the magic on it. Now you've got 3 binary keys. You encrypt the challenge, which is that 6E64FC, encrypt that with the first key, you get a first ciphertext. Second key, you get a second ciphertext, etc. Stick them all together, and you can see where the first ciphertext is 8F86, and that's what they're at the bottom, and it ends with the 62D7. So that's the response. But it's not all the response, because, of course, you have to put that inside a packet. So you create this new message, a type 3 NTLM message, which has got a header, it's got some reserved bits, it's got the computer's domain name, the username, the DNS name, and then the 2 responses. So again, lots of crazy binary, but right there, don't like this podium. Right there you can see the response I've got kind of highlighted. That's the same NTLM response that I had before. That goes back to the server. Server does all the same magic on its side. Responses match. You had the password. You're authenticated. NTLM v2, a little bit more complicated. Rather than just taking the NTLM1 hash, they use that hash as a key to do an HMAC operation on the string of username in uppercase and the target domain, like on your computer, the domain the computer's registered to. That creates an NTLM v2 hash. That is used as an HMAC key for the string, including a challenge, a header, timestamp, the target block we saw before, and nonce, all that kind of stuff. So similar idea, but a little bit deeper. Makes the hash a little bit harder to figure out. So we'll skip that, and here's the response. When you're done, you've got a response. That's the first block that I have highlighted. There's a timestamp, which is not a Unix timestamp. It's a 64-bit little endian timestamp in hundreds of microseconds since January 1st, 1601. I'm not sure why they picked that. That's just what Windows uses. Then there's a nonce, and then there's a target block, which came from the initial type 2 message. So all this stuff gets sent back up. Server does the stuff. You're authenticated. Just like Digest, you don't see that a lot for session credentials. And you've got some of the same benefits and some of the same problems. It doesn't send the password over network, which is great. It has client-server nonces, which helps prevent replay attacks. But again, it's complicated. There's potential for bugs. And again, if the hash is compromised, you can just drop it right into the client side as if they had the password and created the hash on the fly, and you're authenticated without having to crack the passwords. So it's definitely a trade-off. All right. Now, OAuth 1 is kind of neat. It began actually as an open ID for Twitter, and I'll speak briefly of open ID later. And as they were developing that for Twitter, they kind of went off in new directions and said, okay, we're just building a whole new system. They called it OAuth. As I said before, some of these systems, and this one in particular, is not actually authentication, it's an authorization system. And what it's really doing is brokering your application, is brokering authorization from a third-party system. In practice, it's all kind of a blurred distinction, but that's technically what's going on. It makes extensive use of shared secrets and signatures. So here's an example. If Tim wants to let some application, Grail Tweet, accesses Twitter, the application contacts Twitter, says, give me a token. And Twitter says, okay, log in. Now the authentication part is actually happening between the user and Twitter directly. So it's not actually part of the OAuth protocol, it's all happening over here. That could be using really super incredibly secure things, or it could be you just spitting your password out on a public channel and everybody sees it. How that happens is beyond the application, unfortunately. Once you've authenticated to Twitter, you say, okay, here's the request token that you gave me. Do you want to let this app use your account? You say, sure, I want it to use your account. Okay. Take this special code back to your application and punch it in. If you're doing it manually, it'll give you like a 6-digit number. If this is all programmatically, it might be a more extensive string, and it all happens just back and forth in packets the user never sees. So now your application has the original request token it got from Twitter, and it's got the code that you just got from Twitter when you've authorized it. It sends both of those back to Twitter directly, and Twitter says, okay, now you've linked that account to the service. And here it is kind of drawn out. So the app talks to the server, gets a token, takes the token through the user's browser, the user authorizes that token, gets a code back, sends a token and the code back to, in this case, Twitter, and now it links up, it gets an access token, so now the application can continue to use it. And in this case, they call different things. The consumer is the application on the device. The authentication server is the service that you're logging in through, and then the resource server is what you're using to get information from. In the case of Twitter, authentication server and the resource server are the same organization. But sometimes they're not. Sometimes you get a website that says log in using Twitter. In this case, the auth server is Twitter, but the resource server is your box. So that's kind of how they do that. And like I said, there's a lot of secrets. The client has a specific token and secret key that's assigned specifically to the app by the service. So if you want to develop a Twitter account, you go to Twitter and say, yeah, I need an app, I need a key, and you get a client application token and key. And that's long-lived, compiled into the application. It's usually specific to an app or maybe to a developer. And every instance of that app across that platform will have that same key. Then when you first request authorization, you get a specific request token back, and that is a token and a key as well. You use that just for this process and then throw it away. And then once you've finished the system, you get your own account-specific access token and key. Those are what really makes a connection between the app and the service. That stays on the device, hopefully well protected, because that's how you then log in the future. So how does it use all these crazy keys? So you take the things you want to say to the server, the method, the URL, so get, login, that app, or whatever. In this case, we're talking about the request. So you get a callback method, token, nonces, signature method, all that stuff. And that becomes your sort of your authentication string. And then you've got the client secret, which is, again, the secret that's dedicated just to the application. So Tweetbot has a client secret. You use that secret to do an HMAC SHA-1 signature on the string, and that becomes your authorization. Now, the string is crazy the way they build it. And this just looks like absolute hell, but there's a reason for it. They take all the parameters, they turn them to UTF-8, and they URL encode them and put them together using ampersand separations. So that's where you get the OAuth callback and then present 3D OOB. So that's OAuth callback equals out of band and consumer key equals something and. So you get all this ugly string. And then in front of that you put the method, another ampersand, the path, another ampersand. That's your authorization string. Oh, and the parameters have to be sorted in alphabetical order as well. All this is so that the back end can be guaranteed to have created the string in the exact same way as the front end, because if you create with the same parameters, if you create just a little bit different, the hashes won't match. So you do all that stuff, you do a HMAC SHA-1 transaction on it using the client key, and in this case there's an ampersand, because in other cases it would be client and the access key. But right now you just have one, so it's only got the one, but they still add the trailing ampersand. So that's the key. Against the string you get the authorization. And then you send all that up as a header, just like you did for digest. And there you've got all the information that was present in the signed thing and then the signature. All this is just to get permission to ask to connect. So now your app has done all that. Twitter says, okay, here's your temporary token. Then you go through the other thing where you go in through the browser, the user authenticates, they get a code back, it goes back and forth. In the end, you end up with your own OAuth token or an access token. That's at the user level with their own key, and then this OAuth verifier, which is a special code that's sent back. The client receives these, they store them. And then all future requests are built kind of the same way. You do exactly the same thing for every time you send a request to the service, any API call, and it's got the path of the API call right in there. So if somebody steals the authentication off the wire, they can't change it and point it to a different command. And then optionally, you can also include variables for the command. So if you've got some kind of thing here, I say lookup, and if there's a couple of post variables, you can also include them as part of the signature, which prevents, again, the packet from being modified in transit. So you've got some additional integrity protections built in. Now, of course, just like NTLM and digest, you've got a problem with these hashes, with the keys. On the server, you end up with a token and key pair for every account. So every user that's connected their Twitter app to Twitter, there's an authentication token and an access token key on the server associated with that account. If you break into the database and you grab all those keys, you've got everything you need to log in. So one suggestion I've made is that you don't actually store the access token on the server, because when the client connects, let's see if I can see a version that looks easy to read. It sends the OAuth consumer key. It sends the key in the clear to the server. So the server will have it when it's evaluating the request. So what the server can do is take that key in, hash it, use the hash to look up the database. Now they've got your key, they've hashed it, they've looked you up in the database, now they've got your secret key as well, and it can continue and do the authorization. So this way, if somebody breaks into the server, they can get your secret key, but they can't do anything with it because they don't know what public key is associated with it. So that's another way you can try and at least improve the security a little bit on the server side. OAuth 1 overall, it's very strong. It's got nonces, it's got timestamps, it's got signatures, it's got everything you need to have a very strong, secure back and forth. Client only ever stores the access tokens. Once you've authorized, you never send the password over the network. Integrity controls are great. You can also usually individually revoke access by application, so you can go on Twitter and say, I don't use that app anymore, that phone's dead, and you can destroy those tokens so they're no longer valid. But it is very complicated, it can be difficult to understand, and you're relying on the remote service to do that initial authentication. So at one point, they started working on something called the OAuth WRAP, Web Resources Authorization Protocol. And at some point, that kind of took on a life of its own and became OAuth 2. And it took OAuth 1 and simplified it in many ways, made it a lot more complicated in other ways. And it's not really a strictly defined protocol. It's more like a framework that you can build on, extend, expand, do changes to. The big key differences are all the user secrets and all that HMAC signing, it's all gone. It relies exclusively on TLS for security. And you're also obviously relying on local storage for protecting the tokens on the device. There's still a client key and a client secret, but during part of the process, they're just sent straight up to the server as is. Again, there's no signing. Authorization flow is still very similar to what OAuth 1 was. Client requests authorization from the server gives a special grant, which I'll explain in a second. Client then sends that grant to the authorization server, gets a token, and then they use that token for future requests. There are 4 different kinds of grants. The first one is very close to how OAuth 1 works. Usually when you have a different authorization server and resource servers, there's an implicit which is aimed at browser clients. It avoids one of the steps, kind of consolidates it, so it's a faster back and forth because you're just authorizing that current session. Resource owner password credentials actually sends the password to the server in the process, so the authentication actually is happening with an OAuth for that. And then client credentials is very similar, but now you're actually authenticating the client to the server. So that's if there's like an account associated with the application, not as the user. Quick example of this, we see this a lot, like if you have an application that on the web that wants to connect to a user's GitHub account, you're logged into the web app, you say, I want to connect it to GitHub, so it redirects you to GitHub, you log into GitHub and say, hey, I want to authorize this app. So it says, okay, great. Oh, did I show? There it says, sends the client ID. So now that the application is sent to GitHub, the ID of the app, so GitHub knows which web app is trying to connect to it, and a scope, which is basically saying, I want them to be able to list repositories. User says, yes, I'm happy letting this application use it, but first they have to authenticate, so they use whatever GitHub's authentication is, two-factor, et cetera. They authorize the account and say, yes, I agree with that scope. I want to let it look at my repositories. So it goes back to the application. The application then requests the connection. Now it sends the client ID and the client secret and the code that GitHub just gave you, saying, okay, now let's make this link. GitHub sends a token back, and now your accounts are linked together. So kind of ran through OAuth 2 pretty quickly there. But like I said, it's very similar to how it works at how OAuth 1 worked in the conceptual of it, but all the details for the signatures and the hashes and stuff just removed. So now you've got an access token that lives forever, except it's bad to have a token that lives forever. So usually there's a timeout on those, and a lot of times when you first connect, you'll get a refresh token. So you store both of those on your device. The access token is what you use all the time. If it gets compromised, it eventually dies anyway after an hour or a day or something like that. When you make another request with the old access token is denied, you say, oh, well, how about this refresh token? It says, oh, that's great, and that gives you a new access token, and now you can continue on. So you obviously have to make sure both of those are securely stored on the client. It's another reasonably good system. It's open framework. You can extend it. You can do some direct authentication, which is great. Essentially, it's a standard way to have a universal session token, just tokens that any app can implement, same library for whatever you're doing. But because it is so generalized, different systems have implemented things a little differently. Like the GitHub example I showed you won't work exactly for some Google apps, which won't work exactly for some other things. So interoperability may be a pain. So on the one hand, you can have common libraries. On the other hand, in practice, you might not be able to. Also, there's no timestamp or nonces or signatures, so a token is a token is a token. As soon as you grab it, you can use it as often as you want. You can steal it out of the stream, stick it on a different packet, make a different request. They're universally accepted. Okay, I was going to talk about some other systems. I don't really have time. FIDO UTF is very cool, especially the way that YubiKey, which is the first big implementation of it, works. Fantastic tricks that they did to put a whole lot of private keys on a small, very cheap hardware dongle. Definitely fun to look at. JSON Web Token isn't really a system or protocol. It's a way to kind of build a token that has signed data. It's got a header. It's got claims that you care about. And it's got a signature. Base 64, the header and the claims, do a signature, throw it all together. OpenID, distributed authentication identity system, was popular for a while, not as much today. It kind of morphed into OAuth 1. And then the most recent version of this is called OpenID Connect, which is layered on top of OAuth 2. CRAM MD5 I just threw in here because it's something you used to see a lot for email. Another signature or a client challenge response system using HMAC MD5s that had a lot of other weaknesses that are a little bit deeper, largely deprecated. You don't really use this anymore. Shouldn't see this. And then finally, there's obviously public-private keys, very strong, very difficult to attack as long as you don't have bugs in the library or the CA attacks. Can provide additional encryption and authentication. But now you've got to retain a large database of public keys. It's big, it's complicated, it's weird. I rarely see this except sometimes as a way to sort of additionally bind a device to a service. So, wish I could have given more detail on those, but we'll jump into just a quick review. Common elements, like password authentication, uses a password. They all use passwords, except for OAuth 1 where it's not really applicable. In OAuth 2 it's optional. Digest, NTLM, and OAuth 1, both all use signatures and nonces, optional timestamps with digest. It kind of depends on how you build your nonce. OAuth 1 has optional PKI. I didn't mention when in the signature using HMAC SHA-1, you can also do RSA SHA-1. So there's actually a public-private key signature method instead of just the HMAC. But that, I don't think I see that too often. And then both Digest and OAuth 1 can provide integrity protections on the data. So basic is easy. That's a good thing. Digest is resistant to replay. NTLM is resistant to replay. OAuth 1, same thing, revocable tokens. OAuth 2 is simple and revocable tokens. Those are all some good strengths of these protocols. Weaknesses, basic is still sending the password over the wire, especially for Digest, that's a bad, for session authentications, that's a bad thing. Digest mode can be vulnerable to some brute force attacks, server-side storage issues, and then there's the fact that the hash can be reused. NTLM has some of the same issues, especially with the hash reuse. It's complicated, it's binary, and neither Digest or NTLM is used much for sessions. OAuth 1, complicated, that's a drawback. As a matter of fact, the complications in OAuth 1 is part of what drove OAuth 2 to drop all those crazy signature things. And OAuth 2 has very little replay or integrity protections. So throwing all that into a table, red is, in my opinion, bad stuff. Green is, in my opinion, good stuff. You can see password looks not really all that great, but it's kind of hard to avoid, unfortunately. Digest and NTLM are much better for logins, but they've got some serious drawbacks. OAuth 1 is terrific for sessions, fantastic for sessions, but you really can't do the actual initial login with it. And OAuth 2 is just kind of a mixed bag. So if I were to recommend something for logins, nothing's really ideal. I'd like to see something better come up. I'm still looking to see if one already exists. For sessions, I love OAuth 1. I would definitely recommend using that. They say it's a pain in the neck, but I think it's pretty easy to figure out, and there's lots of libraries. So I think the benefits definitely are worth trying to figure out how to use that. There are some other considerations. These things don't happen in a vacuum. You can make the most secure protocol in the world, and it can be no good at all because it takes way too long to process the logins on the server side. On the other hand, you can also move some of that onto other servers that are dedicated to authentication. How often do different hashes work? So the same arguments you have against using bcrypt or scrypt or long PBKDFs, stuff like that on the back end, still things you have to consider in this. You also have to make sure you've got flexibility if you ever want to change your system. If you have different hashes you might eventually move to, you don't want to be necessarily locked in. And also you need to consider client technical capabilities. Not really a capability question, but just an implementation question. I did a talk last year in which I looked at how iOS apps handled authentication, and 2/3 of the apps stored tokens insecurely in a way that an attacker with access to the device could get the token out, and now they've got access to your account. About half of them stored passwords insecurely as well. Another big drawback, OAuth isn't embedded in browsers, so if you want to do that at a web application level, you've got to implement it in JavaScript. Do not implement it in JavaScript. That's just bad. There's a terrific paper that I cite in my white paper from Tom Tasek that just destroys that. It's a bad idea. And of course, password resets are still the weakest link. If you forget your password, how do you get it back? That's where people are really vulnerable, where it's difficult to get this done well. You compromise your target's email account, now you can reset all their passwords. SMS kind of helps, but not necessarily. Sometimes that can be spoofed. What if you've stolen their phone? What if their phone sends their SMS text to the screen and they leave their phone next to their locked Mac, and somebody does a reset and little text shows up on their Mac screen. They say, oh, there's the code. So there's some issues. And of course, attackers in the past have chained one password recovery to another and gotten all kinds of stuff. Because once you get access to one thing, you can use that to prove to a customer service rep that you are that person, you get access to something else, and you move on. So password reset is still a big problem. And then just getting set up with the app, the onboarding of an app, very narrow window for attacks. I mean, it only happens once, but depending on the circumstances, that might be a good target. Like maybe there's a Starbucks app that has some really juicy information that you want to steal, where are people probably going to be onboarding to a Starbucks app? In Starbucks. So if you sit in Starbucks and you hack their network and you're getting all this stuff, maybe you might see somebody using that app for the first time and you get their credentials. Not really good as a targeted attack, but it might be something you could do for a broad spectrum, just serendipity attack. So there's some possibilities of issues there. All right. I had wanted to demonstrate a tool And number one, we're out of time, and number two, the tool's not ready. So that kind of worked out. But when I'm testing applications, a lot of times, I'll see these things go by and say, okay, sometimes it's obvious and you know exactly what's going on. The password's sent in the clear or it's sent as a hash or something like that. You're like, okay, I know what's going on. But sometimes you want to verify if you're not quite 100% sure. You see a hash go by and you think, is that a SHA-256 hash that's unsalted? Well, let's fire up Python, let's try it and find out. So how do you test for things like that? How do you test a custom solution? And I think it's important to be able to do that because you need to understand what's going on. You can't really understand it unless you can prove to yourself that you understand it. So a lot of times I'll find myself custom coding up something to build a hash or break an encryption container, things like that, just to show that I really do understand it. And once I understand it, I can decide whether or not it was safe. So what I was trying to do is come up with a way to build a simple tool to help with at least some of this. What I want to be able to do is to simplify the testing. It can't be completely turnkey. You're still going to have to do a little bit of coding, a little bit of tweaking. And then, of course, somebody who does this for a living will then be able to take it, hopefully, and build on it and just expand or change things as they encounter other systems or as they think they understand it. So what I'm working towards is something where you can either just say, build me a response in OAuth, and it'll prompt you. Say, okay, well, what's the callback code? What's the consumer key? What's the secret? And give all that information, and then it'll spit back a signature that matches that pack. One of the reasons that I saw cited for the development with OAuth 2 was that with OAuth 1, it was difficult for developers to test it because you couldn't simply cut and paste a curl command to test it against the server. And I thought, dear God, it's because people can't do these things on the fly that we've ended up with OAuth 2. So the goal here would be to come up with something that would allow you to test these things manually without having to write crazy code to understand how to build it and stuff like that. Because, again, being able to test these things as you're developing, you obviously have to test it. You want to go with the most secure system possible. So if something can help you understand that secure system better as you're developing, then maybe you'll use the better system. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for with that. Then I'm also looking at, I'm kind of developing like a pseudocode. So you can maybe even create a file that just says, okay, here's the things I want to ask the user for. Here's what I do with them. I join them, I do a hash on them, I join them, I do a hash on them, and there's the result. And so this basically is the digest method, just put in plain pseudocode. So the idea would be that you could do all these things and, again, create the response so you could verify that the app is doing what you think it's doing. Then I'm also kind of considering the idea of doing a full-out client app that can actually reach out to the server and connect and actually prompt the user for the input, just basically to pretend you're a browser, but then also spit out all the intermediate results as it's building the computation, doing all the work, so you can kind of see what's going on behind the scenes and understand it and check things. Maybe be able to fuzz certain parameters and things like that. So maybe the server is vulnerable to nonce reuse. Maybe you can use this to help understand that. And then even potentially doing something same on the server side, pretend to be a server, but again, spit out little bits of data as the authentication progresses so you can get a window into the internal workings of it. There's also http://bin.org, which does some similar stuff. They've got, basically it's just a dead-end site you can send stuff to and get responses back. It's good for testing out apps. And they actually have functionality for basic and digest mode. They don't have NTLM. I think they might have used to, but they don't anymore. So that's something along those lines would also be very useful. So those are things I hope to get out in the next month or two. I think would be useful for people. So to wrap up, got 3 minutes left according to my clock. Again, lots of different ways to do this. Only about 5 ways are in common use. Almost every app that I see uses one of these 5 systems. Like I said, in 5 years of doing app testing, I've only seen other systems a few times, a handful of times. All of them have some strengths, all of them have some weaknesses, all of them have had vulnerabilities against them, either in the implementation or in the protocol itself that you've kind of worked around. OAuth v1 got upgraded to v1a. The strongest is largely written off because it's too hard, and the alternative is, I think, too weak. But I still think there's hope for the future. Improvements to browsers would be great. If we can improve the initial logon exchange, that would be fantastic. If we could integrate OAuth 1 or something similar to that, that would be exceptional. Even if we could have some direct JavaScript interface that could do some of these things in JavaScript without having to write them, that might help, but you still have the issue of whether or not you trust the JavaScript to begin with, because it came from an intermediate server and it might not be trustworthy. Some of the new developments are really exciting. The Fido U2F is cool. It's integrated in Chrome now, and they were adding support to other browsers, so we can change the browser with new systems. So that's great. The growing emphasis in recent years on two-factor and two-step systems is great. Starting to see some alternative authentication systems like Digits, which is great for onboarding. You log into a service and you give it a cell phone number and it bounces a code to your cell phone, and then you log in and it does all the token stuff in the background. You never have to even worry about crazy passwords and emails again. Haven't evaluated whether that's really a good idea or not. I love the concept, but again, you might still fall back into the whole question of password resets and stuff like that. So, but I'm glad that we're seeing things being done. I'll put the slides online. They'll be available at my company site at NCC Group, and I'll also put them on my blog at darthnull.org. Maybe not today, probably tomorrow. I also have a white paper which goes into all the detail for all these things, especially the systems that I glossed over at the end, with a little bit more detail, much better explanations than what I can spit out here at warp speed, and extensive references for not only the actual specs, but also pages that I encountered as I was trying to collect all this information that I found very helpful. One of the reasons I did this whole talk is that whenever I run into something like OAuth, I said, oh, I know how that works, and I start looking at it and said, no, I forget how that works, and I spend an hour searching Google trying to find the one page that explained it to me, and then I understand it again and I go back. So I'm hoping that this white paper and this slide can be a good reference for how some of these things work. And again, once the demonstration tool is finished, I'll be publishing that as well. So that was an awful lot of information in a very short time. I hope I didn't kill anybody's brains on a Sunday morning after the party. Any questions, real quick? Only have a couple minutes. Yes.
It's not quite out yet, but are you familiar with what Steve Gibson is doing with Squirrel? And if not, you should check it out. It's actually kind of cool.
Steve Gibson and Squirrel. I've not heard of that. What is that briefly?
So Steve Gibson is a guy who's been doing a security podcast forever, and he's actually coming up with a new security authentication thing, SQRL, and it involves QR codes, and we worked it out, and I can't explain it in 30 seconds.
Okay.
Probably explain 10 minutes. Go check it out.
Okay, so he's using QR codes and things like that. It might be kind of a similar approach to Digits, where you're taking something totally unusual and out of band to do some of the stuff. Interesting. I'll talk more, but I just got the shut up sign. So thank you all very much.